مسألة عمليات المقاومة هي مسألة غير قابلة للنقاش ولا المساومة ولا لإعادة النظر ولا للتفكير ولا للتأمل، أيا تكن الأثمان وأيا تكن التضحيات.
Hassan Nasrallah has been the dominant leader of Hezbollah for nearly 3 decades. He is seen by many as a resistance figure credited with driving Israel from southern Lebanon. But for others, he's a controversial militia leader whose command of Hezbollah has led to an escalation of conflict in Lebanon and the region. So who is Hassan Nasrallah? And how has Hezbollah evolved under his leadership? Nasrallah was born in 1960 to a working-class Shia family in an impoverished suburb in eastern Beirut. In 1975, during the Lebanese Civil War, he fled with his family to his ancestral home in southern Lebanon. There, he joined the Amal movement, a Shia paramilitary group once known as the Movement of the Deprived. Nasrallah was interested in theology and traveled to Najaf in Iraq for Quranic studies. But he was forced to return to the civil war in Lebanon, which now had grown larger and more complicated. In 1978, Israel's army invaded to root out Palestinian militants, and again in 1982, laying siege to Beirut and destroying large parts of the city. Nasrallah returned to the Amal movement to fight, becoming the group's commander in Bekaa Valley. During this time, Nasrallah became close with Abbas al-Musawi, an influential Shia cleric who had just co-founded a new group called Hezbollah, or Party of God. The group was formed with the backing of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard in response to Israel's invasion of Lebanon at the height of the war in 1982. Nasrallah was drawn in and soon left the Amal movement to enlist. By 1985, Hezbollah had formally declared its existence in an open letter outlining its identity and goals. It called for an armed struggle against Israeli occupation and declared its allegiance to Iran's spiritual leader Ayatollah Khomeini and his doctrine Wilayat al-Faqih, which demanded loyalty to him as the highest religious guide, the Faqih. Nasrallah rose quickly through the ranks of Hezbollah, despite his young age. After al-Musawi was assassinated by Israel in 1992, Nasrallah, aged just 32, replaced his mentor as Hezbollah's leader.
هم يقاتلون قوة مخفية مخبأة قد تفاجئهم في أي يوم من الأيام بهذا العدد الضخم من الصواريخ.
Under Nasrallah's leadership, Hezbollah expanded its domestic influence and became a key political player in Lebanon. The group entered parliamentary elections for the first time in 1992, advocating for the rights of Shia Muslims and the Lebanese working class. He distinguished himself from the country's growing class of elites by capitalizing on Hezbollah's role in resisting Israel. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Hezbollah carried out dozens of attacks on Israeli military targets as Israel continued to occupy a strip of southern Lebanon, deemed a security zone, totaling about 10% of the country's territory.
وقبل أن يسألنا الآخرون ماذا ستفعل المقاومة الإسلامية إذا انسحب الإسرائيلي إلى الحدود الدولية المعترف بها، الحدود بين لبنان وفلسطين، وستبقى اسم هذه الحدود الحدود اللبنانية الفلسطينية. وبالنسبة إلينا لن يكون هناك يوم نقول فيه أو نعترف فيه بحدود لبنانية إسرائيلية.
In 1997, Nasrallah's son was killed during clashes with Israeli forces, fueling his standing as a champion of resistance against occupation in the eyes of his supporters. Hezbollah fought a successful campaign against Israel's occupation of Lebanon. And when Israel withdrew from southern Lebanon in 2000, ending an 18-year occupation, it was declared a victory for the resistance. In 2005, Lebanon's Prime Minister Rafiq al-Hariri, the country's most prominent Sunni figure at the time, was assassinated. He'd been a vocal critic of another regional player that had entered into the country, Syria, who sent thousands of soldiers to fight during the civil war, but maintained a heavy military presence for nearly 3 decades. Many accused both Syria and Hezbollah of having clear motives to kill Hariri, something they both denied. His death would plunge Lebanon into turmoil yet again, and lead to a mass protest movement demanding Syria's withdrawal. Syria was a key political ally to Hezbollah, and although Syrian dominance in Lebanon diminished after the departure of its troops, the two maintained long-standing ties.
نؤكد أيضاً وبكل وضوح وقوفنا إلى جانب سوريا قيادة وشعباً في مواجهة الاستهداف الأمريكي الصهيوني لها ومحاولات الاقتصاص السياسي منها.
And after the 2005 political crisis, Hezbollah's influence had greatly increased. For the first time, it negotiated its way into government, and its members took up ministerial portfolios and began making strategic alliances with Lebanese factions.
لبنان كان دائما مقبرة للغزاة وسيكون مقبرة لأي غزاة جدد.
Nasrallah relied on his charisma to boost Hezbollah's public image. He shored up his support in the marginalized Shia community, the largest of Lebanon's 18 sects, through low-cost or free social welfare services that the Lebanese government failed to provide. Under his watch, Hezbollah built schools, hospitals, and charity organizations. When war broke out again between Israel and Hezbollah in 2006, the group positioned itself as Lebanon's strongest military force, capable of protecting people in southern Lebanon and helping them rebuild their villages.
نحن الآن نعلن انطلاق هذه الورشة في الضاحية في البقاع في الجنوب في كل المناطق.
The war with Israel would prove to be the group's biggest turning point. It began in July 2006 when Hezbollah members captured 2 Israeli soldiers during cross-border attacks. Israel launched a military campaign into southern Lebanon, dropping thousands of bombs and missiles. The month-long war severely damaged Lebanon's infrastructure, displaced 1 million people, and killed more than 1,200 Lebanese people and 165 Israelis. But after 34 days, Israel withdrew. And Hezbollah fighters were celebrated as heroes across the Arab world. Nasrallah's speeches were broadcast on Hezbollah's Al-Manar TV and watched by millions around the region.
ليس انتصار حزب، ليس انتصار طائفة، ليس انتصار فئة، هو انتصار لبنان الحقيقي وشعب لبنان الحقيقي وكل حر في هذا العالم.
Hezbollah's perceived victory shattered the myth of Israel's invincibility and increased Nasrallah's popularity in Lebanon and the region. Throughout the war, Hezbollah documented its guerrilla campaign to promote its military successes and battle readiness, eventually managing to dominate the information war. And although the war resulted in a heavy human cost, for many Arabs, Israel's withdrawal from southern Lebanon in 2000, then its military failure in 2006, marked a series of long-awaited wins. Since the end of the war, Nasrallah rarely appeared in public for fear of being assassinated by Israel. He kept his movements secret and spoke at rallies through video links, but his ambition for Hezbollah did not waver. Following the war, the group led a series of protests to demand a greater share of power and the resignation of the US-backed government of Fuad Sanyuro. In response, thousands of supporters camped out in central Beirut in a bid to overthrow the government. 2 years later, Hezbollah sympathizers and pro-government supporters clashed in Beirut after the government threatened to shut down Hezbollah's private telecommunications network. This time, the government caved and agreed to mediated talks in Doha that resulted in Hezbollah getting veto power over cabinet decisions.
وعلى المكشوف، ويمكن هيك شيء بالعالم كله ما فيه، انه واحد يطلع علنا وشفاف وصادق وبيقول للعالم كله نحن يا خيي على راس السطح موازنة حزب الله ومعاشاته ومصاريفه وأكله وشربه وسلاحه وصواريخه من الجمهورية الإسلامية في إيران.
Hezbollah's political and military alliance with Iran angered many Arab states who feared Tehran's growing influence in the region. Nasrallah used this platform to rally support for Iran, and when war broke out in Syria, he sent his soldiers to fight alongside Bashar al-Assad and help him retain power.
إن وجود مقاتلين ومجاهدين على الأرض السورية هو وكما أعلنا في أكثر من مناسبة بهدف الدفاع عن لبنان والدفاع عن فلسطين وعن القضية الفلسطينية وعن سوريا حضن المقاومة وسند المقاومة.
Hezbollah's intervention enraged the Arab world. It also made them a target for reprisal attacks. In 2013 and 2014, Islamic State militants carried out more than a dozen car bombings in Shia areas in Lebanon, killing dozens of people and injuring hundreds. At home, many Lebanese blamed Hezbollah for exacerbating the situation in Syria and dragging the conflict across its borders. 1.5 million Syrian refugees fled to Lebanon, further straining the country's economy. In 2016, the Gulf Cooperation Council designated Hezbollah as a terrorist group and began to apply pressure on Lebanon's government to limit the group's power. Countries like Saudi Arabia, which had been a key investor in Lebanon, began to shun the country's leaders. They threatened them with sanctions if they didn't curtail the party's grip over domestic politics and their role as a proxy for Iran. This diplomatic pressure, alongside Lebanon's economic crisis, began to push the country towards a breaking point. With skyrocketing prices, a deadlock in parliament, and a failure of basic services like electricity and waste management, the Lebanese people had had enough of the ruling elite, Hezbollah included. In 2019, mass anti-government protests swept across the country, uniting people across sectarian lines. Demonstrators filled the streets, demanding the government to resign and expressing anger at the ruling class for responding to Lebanon's economic crisis by introducing new taxes, including one on WhatsApp calls. Nasrallah spoke out against the new taxes, but rejected calls for resignations, calling it a waste of time. Protesters longing for a political change and better living conditions were angered by Nasrallah's stance.
خطاب السيد ما بيلبي المطالب والتطلعات اللي الناس نزلت لأجلها. حزب الله موجود بهذه الحكومة. إذا كان مشارك أو ساكت عن الفساد واحد.
In August 2020, a massive explosion in Beirut's port sent shockwaves through the city. Entire neighborhoods were leveled, and more than 200 people were killed. But when investigations questioned the role of senior officials in ignoring the threats that led to the explosion, Nasrallah hit back, accusing the judge leading the case of political bias and calling for him to be replaced. Tensions escalated, fueled by the anger of the victims' families who condemned the repeated suspension of the inquiry as an attempt by politicians to evade justice. It culminated in a day of deadly clashes in Beirut. For the first time in years, people feared the country was heading towards renewed sectarian tensions. The pressure to limit Hezbollah's power has been getting louder. The US and Gulf countries placed sanctions against the group's financing in a bid to curb its influence. But Nasrallah remained defiant.
نحن رحنا اعتدينا على السعودية ولا نحن هاجمنا السعودية. هؤلاء هم كانوا شركاء في المؤامرة الكبرى وفي الحرب الكونية التي كانت تدمر المنطقة. ونحن كان لنا شرف أن نقف في وجه هؤلاء القتلة المتآمرين على بلدنا وعلى شعوبنا وعلى دماء ورجال على دماء وأعراض الرجال والنساء في لبنان.
With each crisis that befell Lebanon, Hassan Nasrallah was there to maneuver his party to ever-growing power. For 3 decades, he amassed a political and paramilitary force no one could challenge in Lebanon. A hero to his supporters and a dangerous menace to his adversaries. Now, he faces complex challenges, a country in economic meltdown, tensions with political rivals, and growing international pressure on Hezbollah to put down its arms.